Ever wonder what secrets an abandoned summer camp holds after dark? Tonight, I'm pulling a solo night shift at a forgotten Texas summer camp. And let me tell you, the things I've heard and seen here defy explanation. Get ready to experience the chilling reality of working in a place that time, and maybe some other things forgot. The gravel crunched beneath my worn boots as I stepped out of my rusted pickup truck, the headlights cutting through the thick darkness that had already consumed the sprawling landscape of what was once Camp Willowbrook. The name itself seemed like a cruel joke now. There were no willows here, and the only brook had dried up years ago, leaving behind a cracked riverbed that looked like a scar across the earth. The locals had taken to calling it Camp Desolation, and standing here in the oppressive Texas heat that lingered even after sunset, I understood why. The job posting had been strange enough. Night watchman needed. Abandoned property, excellent pay. Must be comfortable working alone. But desperate times called for desperate measures. After losing my construction job 3 months ago, I couldn't afford to be picky. The pay was triple what any normal security gig offered, which should have been my first red flag. But when you're facing eviction and your unemployment checks have run dry, you don't ask too many questions about why someone needs a watchman for a place that's been abandoned for over a decade. My contact, a nervous man named Benjamin Thorne who claimed to represent the property management company, had met me at a diner 30 miles from here. He'd slid a key across the greasy table, along with an envelope containing my first week's pay in cash. Simple job, he'd said, avoiding eye contact and chain-smoking cigarettes with trembling fingers. Just walk the property. Make sure nobody's vandalizing or trespassing. Nothing complicated. When I'd asked about the unusual pay rate, he'd mumbled something about insurance requirements and liability issues, then quickly changed the subject. Now, standing in front of the camp's main gate, I was beginning to understand that nothing about this job would be simple. The wrought iron gates stood open, hanging at odd angles on rusted hinges that creaked ominously in the slight breeze. Beyond them, a dirt road disappeared into a tunnel of overgrown oak trees whose branches formed a canopy so thick that my flashlight beam barely penetrated the darkness ahead. The camp had been closed since 2011, according to Thorne, after some kind of incident that he refused to elaborate on. Whatever had happened here, it had been enough to make the owners walk away from what must have been a substantial investment. I shouldered my backpack, containing the basic supplies I brought, extra batteries, a thermos of coffee, some sandwiches, and a book I probably wouldn't read, and started down the path. The beam of my heavy-duty flashlight swept back and forth across the crumbling asphalt that was slowly being reclaimed by weeds and small saplings. Every few steps, I could hear something scurrying through the underbrush, probably armadillos or possums. But in the absolute silence of this place, even the smallest sound seemed amplified and threatening. The first building that emerged from the darkness was the main office, a low wooden structure with a wraparound porch that had once been painted bright yellow, but was now a sickly, peeling mess of sun-bleached wood and rust stains. The windows were boarded up with plywood that was warped and water-damaged, and several of the boards had come loose, creating dark gaps that seemed to watch me like empty eye sockets. As I approached the front steps, my flashlight beam caught something white fluttering against the door. A piece of paper, secured with duct tape that had turned brown and brittle with age. I climbed the creaking steps carefully, testing each board before putting my full weight on it, and examined what appeared to be a handwritten note. The handwriting was cramped and urgent, written in blue ink that had faded but was still legible. Rules for night watchmen. Read carefully. 1. Never enter the infirmary after 11 p.m. 2. If you hear children laughing, do not investigate. 3. The lake is off limits from sunset to sunrise. 4. Never acknowledge the whispers. 5. If the mess hall lights turn on by themselves, leave immediately. 6. Do not look directly at the old oak tree by cabin 7. 7. If someone calls your name, Make sure you can see who's calling before responding. 8. Keep all doors locked behind you. 9. Never stay in one place for more than 15 minutes. 10. If you see a figure in a counselor uniform, pretend you don't see them. These are not suggestions. Your life may depend on following them. My hands trembled slightly as I read the list again, the rational part of my mind wanting to laugh at what seemed like an elaborate prank. But something about the desperate handwriting and the way the paper had been secured, as if whoever wrote it was afraid it might blow away or be removed, made my stomach clench with unease. At the bottom of the page, in different handwriting that looked more recent, someone had added, Rule 11. Trust no one who claims to work here. I folded the paper and slipped it into my jacket pocket, though I'd already memorized every word. Thorne hadn't mentioned anything about rules, and this definitely hadn't been part of the job description. But as I stood there on that rotting porch, surrounded by the oppressive darkness of the abandoned camp, I found myself taking the list more seriously than I wanted to admit. Using the key Thorne had given me, I unlocked the main office door. It opened with a groan of protest, releasing a musty smell of mildew and something else, something organic and unpleasant that I couldn't quite identify. My flashlight revealed a small room filled with overturned furniture and scattered papers. A wooden desk sat in the center, its drawers pulled out and emptied, and behind it was a corkboard still decorated with faded photos of smiling children engaged in typical summer camp activities. But there was something wrong with the photos. In each one, no matter what activity was being depicted, there seemed to be an extra figure in the background. A tall person in what looked like a counselor uniform, always positioned just to the edge of the frame and slightly out of focus. In some photos, the figure appeared to be watching the children. In others, it seemed to be looking directly at the camera with what might have been a smile, though the poor focus made it impossible to be certain. On the desk, weighted down with a rock, was another piece of paper. This one was cleaner, written in typed text on official letterhead. Employee Handbook. Night Security Welcome to your new position. The following guidelines will ensure your safety and the security of the property. Deviation from these protocols may result in termination of employment or other consequences. Management is not responsible for incidents resulting from failure to follow established procedures. Primary duties include hourly perimeter checks of all buildings and a complete patrol of the grounds every 3 hours. The route map is attached. Do not deviate from the prescribed path unless absolutely necessary. Special attention should be paid to the following areas. Mess hall, building 1, check all doors and windows. Report any unusual lighting. Infirmary, building 3, external inspection only after 11 p.m. Do not attempt entry. Waterfront area, maintain minimum 50-foot distance from lake edge during night hours. Cabin row, buildings 1 to 12. External visual inspection only. Do not respond to any sounds from within. Remember, you are alone on this property. Any person you encounter should be considered a trespasser and reported immediately to local authorities. Do not engage directly. Emergency contact. The phone number had been scratched out with black ink. I stared at the handbook, my unease growing stronger. The clinical language couldn't disguise the fact that these weren't normal security procedures. What kind of security guard is told not to investigate sounds or enter certain buildings? And why was the emergency contact number deliberately obscured? A sudden creak from somewhere deeper in the building made me freeze. The sound was soft but distinct, the unmistakable groan of a floorboard underweight. I stood perfectly still, listening intently, but heard nothing else. After a moment, I convinced myself it was just the old building settling, though the rational explanation felt thin and unconvincing. I decided to begin my first patrol, following the route marked on the hand-drawn map that had been clipped to the handbook. The path would take me past all the major buildings, around the perimeter of the camp, and down to the lakefront before circling back to the main office. According to the map, The complete route should take about 90 minutes at normal walking pace. As I left the office and began walking toward the first cluster of buildings, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The sensation was so strong that I found myself spinning around every few minutes, sweeping my flashlight beam across the darkness behind me. But I never saw anything except trees and shadows and the occasional glint of animal eyes reflecting the light. The first building on my route was the old Arts and Crafts Center, a long, low structure with large windows that had once provided natural light for whatever creative activities the children had engaged in during the camp's operational years. Now, the windows were covered with the same warped plywood as the main office, though several pieces had fallen away entirely, leaving dark openings that seemed to breathe with the night air. As I approached the building, I heard it, a soft whispering that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. The sound was just at the edge of perception, like voices in a distant conversation, but I couldn't make out any actual words. My first instinct was to move closer, to try to determine the source of the sound, but then I remembered rule number 4 from the list. Never acknowledge the whispers. I forced myself to continue walking, maintaining a steady pace, and keeping my eyes fixed straight ahead. The whispering seemed to grow slightly louder as I passed the building, and I had the distinct impression that it was following me, staying at the same distance, but moving parallel to my path. Every instinct I had screamed at me to investigate, to shine my light toward the sound and find out what was causing it. But I gripped the folded rule sheet in my pocket and kept moving. It wasn't until I was 50 yards past the Arts Center that the whispering finally faded away, leaving me alone with the sound of my own footsteps and the thundering of my heart. I realized I'd been holding my breath and forced myself to breathe normally, though my hand was shaking slightly as I consulted the route map for my next checkpoint. Whatever was happening at Camp Desolation, I was beginning to understand that the rules weren't some elaborate joke or hazing ritual. They were survival instructions, written by someone who had learned through experience what could happen if you didn't follow them. And as I looked ahead at the long row of abandoned cabins that formed my next waypoint, their dark windows staring back at me like dead eyes, I realized that my first night was only just beginning. The question that gnawed at me as I walked deeper into the camp wasn't whether the rules were necessary. I was already convinced they were. The question was whether following them would be enough to keep me safe until sunrise, or if there were dangers here that no list of precautions could protect against. The cabin row stretched out before me like a gauntlet of shadows and decay. 12 identical structures, each one a monument to childhood summers that had ended in something terrible enough to close the camp permanently. According to my route map, I needed to conduct an external visual inspection of each building, checking for signs of trespassing or vandalism. But the handbook had been very clear: external inspection only, and do not respond to any sounds from within. That last instruction was proving difficult to follow. As I approached the first cabin, labeled with a hand-painted wooden sign that read "Chipmunk Den," a sound drifted through one of the broken windows. It was soft and rhythmic, like someone gently rocking in an old chair. The floorboards inside were creaking in a steady pattern. Creak, pause, creak, pause. That spoke of deliberate movement rather than random settling. I stopped walking and consulted the rules again, using my flashlight to reread the relevant sections. Do not respond to any sounds from within, the handbook had said. Any person you encounter should be considered a trespasser and reported immediately to local authorities. But how could I report a trespasser if I wasn't allowed to investigate the sounds they were making? The rocking sound continued as I stood there, wavering between duty and caution. Then it stopped abruptly, and in the sudden silence, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The distinct creak of footsteps moving across the cabin floor toward the front door. I backed away quickly, remembering another rule: never stay in one place for more than 15 minutes. I hadn't been standing there that long, but suddenly the instruction made perfect sense. Whatever was inside that cabin knew I was out here, and it was coming to investigate. The footsteps stopped just inside the door, and I had the horrible certainty that something was standing there, listening for me, just as I was listening for it. The urge to run was almost overwhelming, but I forced myself to move away at a steady, measured pace, following the prescribed route to the next cabin while trying to look like I hadn't heard anything unusual. Cabin 2 was mercifully quiet, as was cabin 3, but as I approached the fourth building in the row, I noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. The door was standing open. I consulted my map again, double-checking the layout. Yes, this was definitely cabin 4, labeled Bear Cave, according to the faded sign hanging askew from a single nail. The door was definitely open, creating a rectangle of absolute darkness that seemed deeper and more impenetrable than the night around it. The problem was, I distinctly remembered walking past the same row of cabins when I first arrived at the camp. I'd used my flashlight to scan the entire area, getting my bearings and familiarizing myself with the layout, and I was certain that all the cabin doors had been closed. Not just closed, but secured with heavy padlocks that showed rust and age, but appeared solid and intact. Now, the padlock lay on the ground beside the front steps, and the door hung open as if someone had simply walked out and forgotten to close it behind them. I approached carefully, playing my flashlight beam across the ground around the cabin. The dirt was too hard and dry to show clear footprints, but I could see disturbed areas where something had scraped or shuffled through the dust. The marks didn't look quite right. They were too wide and too long to be normal shoe prints, and they seemed to drag rather than step. Standing at what I judged to be a safe distance, I aimed my flashlight through the open doorway and tried to illuminate the interior. The beam revealed a typical camp cabin layout. 2 sets of bunk beds along the walls, a few scattered pieces of furniture, and debris on the floor that could have been anything from old clothes to nesting materials left by animals. But at the far end of the cabin, just at the edge of my light's reach, there was something else. A figure was sitting on one of the lower bunks. My heart hammered against my ribs as I strained to make out details. The figure appeared to be wearing what might have been a camp counselor uniform, khaki shorts and a polo shirt. But there was something wrong with the proportions. The arms seemed too long, and the head was tilted at an angle that suggested either injury or a flexibility that human necks weren't designed for. For several long seconds, we stared at each other across the threshold of that cabin, and I found myself remembering rule number 10. If you see a figure in a counselor uniform, pretend you don't see them. Pretending not to see something that was clearly staring back at me proved to be one of the most difficult things I'd ever done. Every instinct screamed at me to either flee or confront whatever was sitting in that bunk, but instead, I forced myself to turn away and continue my patrol as if nothing had happened. I kept my flashlight pointed ahead and walked at the same steady pace I'd maintained since leaving the main office, though I could feel that unnatural gaze following me until I rounded the corner and lost sight of the open cabin door. My hands were shaking badly enough now that the flashlight beam wavered noticeably, casting dancing shadows that made every tree and bush look like a potential threat. I paused beside a large oak tree to steady myself and take a few deep breaths, trying to process what I just encountered. The rational part of my mind offered various explanations. It could have been a vagrant or trespasser who had broken into the cabin for shelter. The strange proportions I'd observed could have been tricks of light and shadow, or the effects of distance and an inadequate flashlight beam. The unnatural head angle could have been someone sleeping in an uncomfortable position, or even a collection of discarded clothes and equipment that had created the illusion of a human figure. But even as I tried to convince myself of these logical possibilities, I knew I didn't believe them. There had been something fundamentally wrong about the figure in that cabin, something that went beyond mere human trespassing. The way it had sat so perfectly still, the way it had seemed to be waiting for me rather than surprised by my presence, and most disturbing of all, the way it had felt familiar, as if I'd seen it before in the old photographs on the office corkboard. I checked my watch. 10:45 p.m. According to my route, I still needed to inspect the remaining cabins, check the mess hall, and do a perimeter walk around the entire camp property. The mess hall was next on my list, and I remembered that it came with its own specific warning. If the mess hall lights turn on by themselves, leave immediately. The mess hall was a larger building situated at the center of the camp, designed to accommodate all the campers and staff for communal meals and activities. As I approached it, I could see that it had suffered more damage than some of the other structures. Several windows were broken entirely rather than just boarded up, and part of the roof had collapsed, leaving a gaping hole that exposed the interior to the elements. I walked slowly around the perimeter of the building, checking each window and door as instructed. Most of the windows were too high or too damaged to see through clearly, but when I reached the main entrance, I found that the double doors were standing slightly ajar. A chain and padlock hung from the handles, but the chain had been cut with bolt cutters or a similar tool, leaving clean, bright metal edges that suggested the damage was recent. Through the gap between the doors, I could see into the main dining area. Tables and benches were scattered throughout the space, many of them overturned or stacked haphazardly against the walls. The floor was littered with debris, papers, broken dishes, what looked like old food containers, and in one corner, I could see what appeared to be a makeshift campsite with sleeping bags and personal belongings. Someone had definitely been living here, and recently. The question was whether they were still inside. I was about to call out to identify myself as security and ask anyone inside to come out peacefully when I remembered the handbook's instruction about treating any person I encountered as a trespasser to be reported to authorities rather than engage directly. But I also remembered that the emergency contact number had been scratched out, leaving me with no way to report anything to anyone. As I stood there trying to decide on the best course of action, the lights inside the mess hall suddenly flickered on. It wasn't a gradual warming of incandescent bulbs or the steady glow of fluorescent tubes. Instead, every light in the building blazed to life simultaneously, casting harsh shadows through the broken windows and creating a pool of brilliant illumination in the middle of the dark camp. The sudden contrast was so startling that I took several involuntary steps backward, blinking against the unexpected glare. Rule number 5 came back to me with crystal clarity. If the mess hall lights turn on by themselves, leave immediately. I turned and ran. There was no shame in it, no hesitation or second-guessing. The rules had been written by someone who knew this place, someone who had learned through experience what happened when you ignore the warnings. I wasn't being paid enough to discover what would happen if I stayed to investigate those lights, and frankly, no amount of money would have been enough. I ran back toward the main office, following the path I'd already traveled, but moving much faster now, my flashlight beam jerking wildly as my feet pounded against the uneven ground. Behind me, the mess hall continued to blaze with electric light, creating a beacon that was visible through the trees no matter how far I got from it. It wasn't until I reached the safety of the main office porch that I stopped running and turned to look back. The lights were still on, turning the mess hall into a brilliant rectangle of illumination that seemed completely at odds with the decrepit, abandoned nature of the rest of the camp. There was no logical reason for those lights to be working. The camp had been abandoned for over a decade, and there was no indication that electricity was still connected to any of the buildings. I sat down heavily on the office steps, trying to catch my breath and make sense of what I'd experienced. 2 hours into my first shift, and I'd already encountered an impossible figure in a cabin, mysterious whispers that seemed to follow me, and a building that apparently had access to electrical power despite being abandoned for years. The rules that had seemed like paranoid nonsense when I first read them were proving to be essential survival instructions. But what disturbed me most wasn't the supernatural elements I was encountering. It was the growing realization that someone had written those rules based on personal experience. Someone had worked this job before me, had encountered the same phenomena I was seeing, and had survived long enough to write down warnings for whoever came next. The question was, what had happened to them? I checked my watch again, 11:15 p.m. According to the schedule, I was supposed to conduct another complete patrol in about an hour and a half, which would take me back past the cabin with the open door, back past the mess hall with its impossible lights, and down to the lakefront area that was off limits from sunset to sunrise according to rule number 3. As I sat there on those creaking steps, surrounded by the darkness of camp desolation and trying to work up the courage for my next patrol, I heard something that made every hair on my arm stand on end. Somewhere in the distance, drifting through the night air like a half-remembered dream, came the sound of children laughing. Rule number 2 echoed in my mind. If you hear children laughing, do not investigate. But as that innocent, joyful sound continued to drift through the abandoned camp, mixing with the whispers I could still hear at the edge of perception and punctuated by the electric hum of the impossibly lit mess hall, I realized that following the rules might not be enough. Some things, once awakened, don't go back to sleep easily. The sound of children laughing continued for exactly 7 minutes. I know because I timed it, watching the second hand crawl around my watch face while that innocent, joyful noise drifted through the camp like an audio recording played through speakers hidden in the trees. It wasn't the kind of laughter you'd expect from children who had broken into an abandoned summer camp for a late-night adventure. There was something too perfect about it, too synchronized, as if a dozen voices were following the same script. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed was so complete that I could hear my own pulse hammering in my ears. I sat on the office steps for another 10 minutes, waiting to see if the laughter would resume. But the camp had returned to its previous state of oppressive quiet, broken only by the distant hum of the mess hall's impossible lights. I forced myself to stand up and continue with my duties. According to the route map, I still had several areas to inspect before my first patrol was complete, and despite every instinct screaming at me to get in my truck and drive away, I found myself oddly determined to see this through. Maybe it was professional pride, or maybe it was the substantial paycheck I had desperately needed, but something kept me moving forward into the darkness. My next checkpoint was the infirmary, and as I approached the small white building, I remembered rule number 1 with uncomfortable clarity. Never enter the infirmary after 11 p.m. It was currently 11:47, which meant I was limited to an external inspection only. The infirmary sat slightly apart from the other camp buildings, positioned to provide easy access from all areas of the camp, while maintaining the quiet atmosphere that sick or injured children would need for recovery. It was smaller than the mess hall, but larger than the individual cabins, with a covered porch and several large windows that would have provided natural light during operational hours. Now, those windows glowed with a soft, warm light that spilled out onto the surrounding ground. I stopped walking and stared at the building, trying to process what I was seeing. Unlike the harsh, electric glare of the mess hall lights, this illumination was gentle and inviting, the kind of light you might see in a cozy home on a winter evening. It seemed to pulse slightly, growing brighter and dimmer in a rhythm that reminded me uncomfortably of breathing. According to the rules, I was supposed to ignore any light I saw in the infirmary, but that instruction had been written before someone turned on every light in the camp. The soft glow wasn't threatening like the mess hall's blazing fluorescence, but somehow it was more unsettling. This light felt deliberate, purposeful, as if someone inside was waiting for visitors. I walked around the building's perimeter, maintaining the minimum safe distance while trying to peer through the windows. The glass was old and warped, and the light inside created too much glare for me to make out specific details. But I could see shapes moving around in what appeared to be the main treatment room. The movements were slow and methodical, suggesting someone going about familiar tasks rather than investigating or searching. As I completed my circuit of the building, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. In the soft dirt beside the infirmary's back door, there were footprints. But these weren't the dragging marks I'd seen at the cabin with the open door. These prints were small and precise, clearly made by children's feet, and they led from the door to the edge of the woods before disappearing into the underbrush. There were a lot of them, overlapping and crisscrossing, as if a group of children had gathered by the back door before dispersing into the forest. Some of the prints were so fresh that I could see individual tread patterns from tennis shoes and sandals, as if they'd been made within the last few hours. I knelt down to examine the tracks more closely, and that's when I noticed something that turned my confusion into genuine terror. The prints led away from the building, disappearing into the woods as I'd observed, but there were no corresponding tracks leading to the infirmary. It was as if a group of children had simply materialized inside the building and then walked out the back door into the forest. I stood up quickly and backed away from the infirmary, my mind racing through possible explanations and finding none that made sense. The building had been abandoned for over a decade, but the lights were on and there were fresh footprints in the dirt. The prints showed children leaving the building, but there was no evidence of how they'd gotten inside in the first place. And somewhere in my memory, I could still hear the sound of their laughter echoing through the camp. I consulted my route map with shaking hands, trying to focus on completing my assigned tasks and getting through the night one checkpoint at a time. The next area on my patrol was the waterfront, which came with its own specific warning. The lake is off limits from sunset to sunrise. The path to the lake led through a wooded area that had once been carefully maintained with gravel walkways and wooden benches, but was now overgrown with thorny vines and saplings that reached across the trail like grasping fingers. My flashlight beam revealed the skeletal remains of a wooden boardwalk that had once provided easy access to the water, but most of the planks were missing or rotted through, leaving only the support posts standing like grave markers in the darkness. As I approached the shoreline, I could hear the gentle lapping of water against the muddy bank and smell the rich, organic scent of lake water mixed with decaying vegetation. The lake itself stretched out into the darkness beyond the reach of my flashlight, its surface so still and black that it looked like a pool of oil rather than water. I stopped at what I judged to be the 50-foot minimum distance specified in the handbook and tried to conduct my visual inspection from there, but the darkness made it impossible to see much beyond the immediate shoreline. I could make out the remains of a small dock that had partially collapsed into the water, and what might have been an overturned canoe or kayak lying half submerged in the shallows, but the details were unclear. What was clear, however, was that something in the lake was watching me. I couldn't see it directly, but I could feel its attention like a physical weight pressing against my consciousness. The sensation was similar to what I'd experienced at the cabin with the open door, but stronger and more focused. Whatever was in that water was aware of my presence and was studying me with an intelligence that felt decidedly non-human. The surface of the lake began to ripple, not with the random patterns of wind or small fish, but with purposeful movement that suggested something large traveling just beneath the surface. The ripples formed concentric circles that expanded outward from a point roughly 30 feet from shore, and as I watched, the disturbance began moving parallel to the shoreline, maintaining the same distance from land while pacing back and forth like a caged animal. I remembered rule number 3 and took several more steps backward, increasing my distance from the water's edge. The movement on the surface immediately stopped, and the lake returned to its previous mirror-like stillness. But I could still feel that presence watching me, waiting to see what I would do next. According to my route map, I was supposed to walk along the shoreline to inspect the old swimming area and the remains of the boathouse. But there was no way I was getting any closer to that water. Whatever was in the lake had already demonstrated that it was aware of my presence and responsive to my movements, and I had no desire to test the limits of its patience or territorial instincts. I marked the waterfront area as inspected in my mental checklist and turned to head back toward the main camp. But as I walked away from the lake, I heard something that made me stop in my tracks. Someone was calling my name. The voice was distant and muffled, as if it was coming from underwater, but it was definitely calling David in a tone that suggested urgency or distress. My first instinct was to call back, to identify the source of the voice and offer help. But then I remembered rule number 7. If someone calls your name, make sure you can see who's calling before responding. I turned around and aimed my flashlight back toward the lake, sweeping the beam across the shoreline and the water surface, but I couldn't see anyone. The voice called my name again, closer this time, and I realized with growing horror that it seemed to be coming from the lake itself, as if someone was treading water just beyond the reach of my light and calling for help. The rational part of my mind pointed out that no one could have known my name. I'd only met one person in connection with this job, and Benjamin Thorne was certainly not swimming in an abandoned lake in the middle of the night. But the voice was so clear and so desperate that it took all my willpower not to move closer to the water's edge and try to offer assistance. "David, please help me," the voice called again, and this time I could hear the splash of someone struggling in the water. I can't swim much longer. I gripped the rule sheet in my pocket and forced myself to turn away from the lake and continue walking back toward the main camp. Behind me, the voice continued calling my name with increasing desperation. I could hear more splashing as if multiple people were now in distress. By the time I walked 50 yards from a shoreline, it sounded like a dozen voices were calling for help, all of them using my name, all of them growing weaker and more panicked as I moved away. The hardest part wasn't ignoring the voices. It was ignoring the possibility that they might be real, that there might actually be people in that lake who needed help and were going to die because I was too afraid to break the rules and investigate. But the rules had been written by someone who understood this place better than I did. And if rule number 7 said not to respond to voices I couldn't see, then I had to trust that there was a very good reason for that instruction. The voices from the lake finally faded as I reached the edge of the wooded area, but they were replaced by something that might have been even worse: silence. The oppressive quiet that settled over the camp felt expectant, as if the entire place was holding its breath and waiting for something to happen. I checked my watch, 12:23 a.m. My first patrol was officially complete, but I still had over 6 hours before sunrise, and according to the schedule, I was supposed to conduct complete perimeter checks every 3 hours. That meant I'd have to make this same circuit at least 2 more times before my shift ended, revisiting all the same locations where I'd encountered impossible things and unexplainable phenomena. As I walked back toward the main office to file my report and plan my next patrol, I found myself studying the rules more carefully, looking for clues about what I might encounter as the night progressed. Most of the instructions seemed designed to avoid specific dangers. Don't go near the lake, don't investigate the lights or voices, don't acknowledge the whispers. But rule number 9 struck me as different. Never stay in one place for more than 15 minutes. This wasn't about avoiding a specific location or phenomenon. This was about constant movement, about never remaining stationary long enough for something to locate and approach me. It suggested that whatever inhabited this camp was actively hunting, and that staying mobile was my only defense against being found. The implications of that realization were deeply unsettling. But as I approached the main office and saw that the mess hall lights were still blazing in the distance, I found myself grateful for whoever had taken the time to write down these warnings. Without them, I probably wouldn't have survived my first hour at Camp Desolation. But the night was still young, and something told me that the rules were about to be tested in ways their original author had never anticipated. I spent the next 2 hours stationed at the main office, trying to make sense of everything I'd experienced and preparing for my second patrol. The building felt like a sanctuary compared to the rest of the camp, though I made sure to follow rule number 9 and change my position every 10 minutes, sometimes sitting at the desk, sometimes standing by the window, sometimes pacing the small perimeter of the room. During one of these position changes, I noticed something I'd missed during my initial inspection. Carved into the wooden surface of the desk, almost invisible unless you looked at it from just the right angle, were additional words scratched in the same desperate handwriting as the original rules. They learn. They adapt. The rules may not be enough anymore. Michael, day 12-inch. Below that, in different handwriting, Michael is gone. Something took him near the old oak tree. Added rule about not looking at it. Stay strong. Jennifer, night 3-inch. And below that, in yet another hand, Jennifer never made it to day 4. I found her uniform by the lake. They're getting smarter. Trust no one in counselor clothes, even if they seem human. Carlos, final entry. My blood ran cold as I traced the carved letters with my finger. These weren't just random warnings from paranoid security guards. They were messages from people who had worked this job before me. People who had learned the rules through deadly trial and error. And judging by the increasingly desperate tone of the messages, none of them had lasted very long. The most disturbing part was the progression I could see in their observations. Michael had noted that they learned and adapted. Jennifer had discovered something specific about the old oak tree that had cost Michael his life. Carlos had realized that whatever inhabited the camp was intelligent enough to mimic human appearance, wearing the uniforms of camp counselors to deceive the unwary. I thought about the figure I'd seen in the cabin earlier, sitting on the bunk in what had appeared to be a counselor uniform. At the time, I'd followed rule number 10 and pretended not to see it, but now I wondered if that had been enough. Had it realized I was aware of its presence? Was it even now changing its tactics, adapting its behavior based on what it had learned from our encounter? At 2:30 a.m., I forced myself to begin my second patrol. The route would be the same as before, but everything felt different now that I understood the true nature of my situation. I wasn't just a security guard making routine checks. I was the latest in a series of people who had been hired to face something that had already killed or driven away multiple predecessors. The first sign that things had changed came when I reached the cabin row. The door to cabin 4 was now closed and secured with a new padlock that definitely hadn't been there before. But cabin 7, the one near the old oak tree that Jennifer had warned about, was standing wide open, its interior dark and uninviting. I approached carefully, remembering rule number 6. Do not look directly at the old oak tree by cabin 7. The massive tree loomed beside the building, its gnarled branches reaching out like arthritic fingers against the star-scattered sky. I kept my eyes focused on the cabin itself, using only my peripheral vision to navigate around the tree's root system. Inside the open cabin, I could see signs of recent disturbance. The bunk beds had been rearranged, pushed against the walls to create an open space in the center of the room. In that space, someone had drawn symbols on the wooden floor using what looked like chalk or white paint. The symbols weren't anything I recognized. They seemed to blend elements of various religious and occult traditions, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly. But what made my stomach clench with fear was what I found lying beside the symbols. A security guard's uniform, neatly folded and placed as if waiting for someone to put it on. The name tag read Michael. I backed away from the cabin quickly, my mind racing through the implications. If Michael's uniform was here, then what had happened to Michael himself? And why had his clothes been arranged so carefully, as if they were some kind of offering or tribute? As I turned to continue my patrol, I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. Something was standing beside the old oak tree, perfectly still and watching me. I forced myself not to look directly at it, but I could sense its presence like a cold weight against my consciousness. It seemed taller than a normal person, with proportions that weren't quite right, and it cast no shadow despite the brightness of my flashlight. I walked away at a steady pace, fighting the urge to break into a run, and didn't look back until I was well clear of the cabin area. When I finally did turn around, the space beside the oak tree was empty, but I had the disturbing feeling that whatever had been standing there was now following me, staying just outside the range of my flashlight and matching my pace step for step. The mess hall lights were still blazing when I reached the central area of the camp, but something had changed there as well. The doors were no longer just slightly ajar. They were standing wide open, creating a rectangle of harsh light that spilled out onto the surrounding ground. And from inside the building came the sound of activity. Chairs scraping against the floor, dishes clattering, and what might have been muffled conversation. I remembered rule number 5 and didn't even slow down as I passed the building, but I couldn't avoid seeing what was happening inside. The mess hall was full of people. They were seated at the tables in orderly rows, all wearing camp counselor uniforms, all perfectly still and silent despite the sounds of activity I could hear. Their faces were turned toward the windows, watching me as I walked past, and in the harsh fluorescent lighting, I could see that their expressions were identical, blank, peaceful smiles that didn't reach their eyes. One of them raised a hand and waved at me with slow, mechanical precision. I forced myself to keep walking, to maintain the same steady pace I'd used throughout the night, but my heart was hammering so hard that I felt lightheaded. The mess hall had been empty during my first patrol. I was certain of it. The lights had been on, but there had been no sign of occupants. Now the building was full of figures in counselor uniforms, all watching me with those horrible, empty smiles. Rule number 10 echoed in my mind. If you see a figure in a counselor uniform, pretend you don't see them. But what happened when there were dozens of them, all gathered in one place, all clearly aware of my presence? I was still pondering that question when I heard footsteps behind me. The sound was rhythmic and purposeful, like someone walking with military precision, and it was getting closer. I resisted the urge to look back, instead consulting my route map and trying to identify the nearest safe area where I could take shelter if necessary. "Excuse me," a voice called out behind me. "Excuse me, sir." The voice was friendly and professional, exactly what you'd expect from a camp counselor addressing a visitor. But I remember Carlos's final warning about trusting no one in counselor clothes, even if they seemed human, and I kept walking without turning around. "Sir, I need to speak with you about the safety protocols." The voice continued, closer now. "There have been some changes to the rules that you need to be aware of." This made me pause despite myself. Changes to the rules? That suggested that someone in authority was still managing this place, still updating the procedures based on new information. But it could also be exactly the kind of thing that one of those figures would say to get me to stop running and engage with it directly. I compromised by stopping, but not turning around. "What kind of changes?" I called out, addressing my words to the darkness ahead of me rather than the presence behind me. "Well, for starters," the voice said, and now it sounded like it was standing right behind me. "Rule number 10 has been updated. You're no longer supposed to pretend you don't see us. In fact, we've been waiting all night for you to acknowledge us properly." The voice had changed subtly as it spoke, becoming less human and more mechanical, like a recording that was starting to distort. I realized with growing terror that whatever was behind me was no longer even trying to sound convincing. "Turn around, David," it said. And now there was something hungry in its tone. "Let's see your face. Let's welcome you properly to Camp Desolation." Instead of turning around, I ran. I ran faster than I'd ever run in my life, crashing through the underbrush and leaping over fallen logs while behind me, I could hear multiple sets of footsteps giving chase. The counselor figures from the mess hall had apparently joined the pursuit, and they moved with inhuman speed and coordination, their footsteps creating a rhythmic thunder that seemed to shake the ground beneath my feet. I burst out of the tree lean near the Arts and Crafts Center, gasping for air and trying to orient myself in the darkness. My flashlight had gone out during the run. Either the batteries had died or it had been damaged when I'd crashed through a particularly thick patch of thorns, and now I was navigating by moonlight and memory alone. Behind me, the footsteps had stopped, but I could hear voices calling my name from multiple directions. Some of them sounded like the counselor figure that had been chasing me, but others were different. A woman's voice, a child's voice, even what might have been my own mother calling me in for dinner 20 years ago. "David, where are you going?" The woman's voice called sweetly. "The orientation isn't over yet. You still need to learn the new rules. Come back and play with us, David," added the child's voice, giggling with innocent joy that made my skin crawl. We've been waiting so long for someone new to play with. I forced myself to ignore the voices and focus on finding my way back to the main office. But as I stumbled through the darkness, I realized that the camp's layout seemed to have changed. Paths that I'd memorized during my earlier patrols now led to different destinations, and buildings that should have been in specific locations were simply gone, replaced by empty clearings or dense patches of forest. It was as if the camp itself was alive and shifting, rearranging itself to prevent my escape. I finally found a building that looked familiar, the old Arts and Crafts Center where I'd first heard the whispers, and decided to take shelter inside while I figured out my next move. The door was unlocked, hanging loose on rusted hinges, and I slipped inside as quietly as possible. The interior was dark and musty, filled with the remains of long-abandoned craft projects and art supplies. Tables were scattered throughout the room, their surfaces covered with dried paint and glue, and the walls were decorated with faded examples of camper artwork. Handprint turkeys, finger-painted landscapes, and crayon drawings of stick figure families. But in one corner of the room, someone had created something new, scrawled across the wall in what looked like red paint. Though I try not to think too hard about what it might actually be, was a message in handwriting I didn't recognize. "The rules are broken. They know we're here. They're coming for all of US. If you're reading this, run. Don't look back. Don't trust anyone. The camp doesn't want to let US go. Elena, final warning." Below the message, someone had drawn a crude map showing what appeared to be escape routes from the camp. Several paths were marked with X's, indicating they were blocked or dangerous, but one route, leading through the woods behind the infirmary and around the far side of the lake, was circled multiple times and labeled "Only Way Out." As I studied the map, trying to memorize the route Elena had identified, I heard something that made my blood freeze in my veins. The sound of children singing. It was coming from somewhere nearby, a sweet, innocent melody that I recognized as a traditional camp song. But the voices were wrong. Too many of them, too perfectly synchronized, and underneath the melody, I could hear something else. A low, rhythmic chanting in a language I didn't recognize. Words that seemed to vibrate in my bones and make my teeth ache. The singing was getting closer. I looked around desperately for another way out of the building, but there was only one door and the windows were too small and too high to provide an escape route. I was trapped, and whatever was singing that horrible song was coming straight for me. The voices reached the door of the Arts and Crafts Center and stopped. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears and the sound of my labored breathing, which seemed impossibly loud in the confined space. Then, very softly, someone knocked on the door. "David," a child's voice called sweetly. "Are you in there, David? We know you're scared, but there's nothing to be afraid of. We just want to play." More voices joined in, creating a chorus of children calling my name and asking me to come out and play with them. They sounded so innocent, so genuinely concerned for my welfare, that for a moment I almost believed they were real children who had somehow gotten lost in the camp and needed help. But then I remembered the fresh footprints I'd seen behind the infirmary, the tracks that showed children leaving the building but never entering it. These weren't lost campers. They were something else, something that had learned to mimic the voices and mannerisms of the children who had once attended Camp Desolation. "Please don't hide from us, David," one of the voices pleaded. "We've been so lonely since the counselors left. We just want someone to take care of us." The door handle began to turn slowly, and I realized with horror that I'd never bothered to check if there was a lock. The door was starting to open, revealing a slice of darkness beyond, and I could see small shapes moving in that darkness. Children's silhouettes that seemed to flicker and shift as if they weren't entirely solid. I grabbed the heaviest object I could find, an old pottery wheel that had been abandoned in one corner, and hurled it at the large window on the far side of the room. The glass shattered with a crash that seemed incredibly loud in the night air, and without hesitation, I dove through the opening. I landed hard on the ground outside, feeling glass cut through my jacket and into my arms and shoulders, but adrenaline kept me moving. Behind me, I could hear the children's voices rising into angry shrieks, no longer bothering to sound human or innocent. I ran into the woods, following Elena's mapped escape route as best I could remember it, while behind me the entire camp seemed to come alive with pursuit. Lights blazed from buildings that should have been dark, voices called my name from every direction, and I could hear the sound of footsteps, dozens of them, crashing through the underbrush in coordinated pursuit. But worst of all, I could hear the camp itself changing around me, trees creaking as they moved to block potential escape routes, the ground shifting beneath my feet to create obstacles and dead ends. Camp desolation didn't want to let me go, and as I stumbled through the darkness toward what I hoped was freedom, I realized that Elena had been wrong about one thing. There was no way out. The camp had been waiting for me all along. The forest around me had become a living maze, branches reaching out like grasping fingers and roots rising from the ground to catch my stumbling feet. Every direction I turned seemed to lead deeper into the woods rather than toward the perimeter of the camp. And behind me, the sounds of pursuit were growing closer and more coordinated. The children's voices had multiplied into a chorus of dozens, maybe hundreds, all calling my name with increasing urgency. But now they were joined by adult voices, the counselor figures I'd seen in the mess hall, all speaking in perfect unison as they announced their intentions with terrifying clarity. David belongs to the camp now, they chanted in harmony. David will stay with us forever. David will help us find more friends to play with. I crashed through a particularly thick patch of undergrowth and found myself in a small clearing that I didn't recognize from any of my previous patrols. In the center of the space stood a structure that definitely hadn't been on my route map. A tall wooden platform that might have once been used for outdoor activities or nature observation, but now it served a different purpose entirely. The platform was covered with items that I recognized with growing horror, personal belongings that had obviously been left by previous security guards. A jacket with Michael embroidered on the chest. A woman's purse containing ID cards and photos that identified its owner as Jennifer Martinez. A man's wallet with Carlos Hoffman's driver's license visible through the plastic window. And at the base of the platform, arranged in a neat circle, were more counselor uniforms than I could count. All different sizes, all bearing name tags with different identities, all waiting for their new occupants. I realized that I was looking at the camp's collection, trophies taken from everyone who had worked here before me, everyone who had tried to follow the rules and survive their shifts at Camp Desolation. The uniforms weren't just disguises that the entities wore to deceive their victims. They were the actual clothes of real people who had been consumed by whatever inhabited this place. A name tag on the uniform closest to me read, Elena Vasquez. "You found our memory garden," a voice said behind me, and I spun around to see one of the counselor figures standing at the edge of the clearing. In the moonlight, I could see that its face was a horrible patchwork of different features. Elena's eyes, Michael's nose, Jennifer's mouth, all stitched together into a grotesque approximation of humanity. "We keep a little piece of everyone who stays with us," it continued, its voice shifting between different tones and accents as if it couldn't decide which of its absorbed personalities should be speaking. "Soon we'll have a piece of you too, David. Won't that be nice?" More figures emerged from the woods around the clearing, all wearing counselor uniforms, all displaying the same horrible mixture of stolen features. They moved with that same mechanical precision I'd observed earlier, forming a perfect circle around me with practiced efficiency. The rules were never meant to protect you. The first figure explained with Michael's voice coming from Jennifer's lips. They were meant to make the game more interesting, to give us something to hunt, something to chase, something to eventually catch and add to our collection. I looked around desperately for an escape route, but the circle was complete and closing slowly. The counselor figures moved in perfect synchronization, taking one step forward every few seconds, gradually reducing the size of my prison. That's when I remembered something Elena had written on the wall of the Arts and Crafts Center. Something about the camp not wanting to let us go. Not couldn't, but wouldn't. The distinction was important because it suggested that escape was possible, but only if I could find a way to break whatever hold this place had on its victims. I thought about the progression I'd observed throughout the night, the way the supernatural activity had escalated, the way the entities have become bolder and more direct in their approach. They had started by following the rules, staying hidden, and using subtle intimidation tactics. But as the night wore on, they had abandoned those limitations and begun hunting me openly. What if the rules weren't just survival instructions? What if they were also binding constraints, some kind of supernatural contract that limited what the entities could do as long as their victims followed the prescribed guidelines? If that was true, then breaking the rules wouldn't make me more vulnerable. It might actually free me from whatever power the camp held over people who entered its domain. I pulled the folded rule sheet from my pocket and held it up so all the counselor figures could see it clearly. "You know what?" I said, my voice shaking but determined. "I quit." And then I tore the paper in half. The reaction was immediate and violent. All the counselor figures let out a collective shriek that seemed to come from multiple throats at once, a sound of pure rage and frustration that made the trees around the clearing shake and sent birds erupting from the canopy in panicked flight. "You can't do that," they screamed in unison. "The rules must be followed. The game must continue." But even as they protested, I could see that something fundamental had changed. The perfect synchronization of their movements was broken, and they no longer moved as a single coordinated entity. Some of them stumbled and fell as if they'd forgotten how to control their stolen bodies, while others began fighting among themselves, different absorbed personalities struggling for dominance. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran toward the gap that had opened in their circle when several of the figures collapsed, leaping over their writhing forms and crashing back into the woods. Behind me, the sounds of chaos continued to grow. The counselor figures were tearing each other apart, their composite forms coming undone as the various stolen identities fought for control. Trees were falling with tremendous crashes, and the ground itself seemed to be heaving and buckling as if the camp's foundations were collapsing. But for the first time all night, I felt like I was actually moving toward the perimeter of the property rather than being led in circles. The invisible barriers that had been hurting me deeper into the camp were gone, and I could sense open road somewhere ahead through the trees. I ran harder than I'd ever run in my life, ignoring the branches that tore at my clothes and the roots that tried to trip me, focusing only on the growing certainty that freedom was just ahead. Behind me, the sounds of the camp's death throes were fading into the distance, replaced by the blessed silence of normal woods filled with normal nocturnal animals. When I finally burst out of the tree line and saw my pickup truck sitting exactly where I'd left it beside the camp's main gate, I almost cried with relief. The keys were still in my pocket, the engine turned over on the first try, and within seconds I was speeding down the gravel road away from Camp Desolation as fast as my old truck could carry me. I didn't stop driving until I reached the 24-hour diner where I'd first met Benjamin Thorne, and even then I sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes, engine running and doors locked, making sure that nothing had followed me from the camp. Inside the diner, I ordered coffee and tried to process everything that had happened. The rational part of my mind wanted to dismiss the entire experience as some kind of elaborate hallucination brought on by stress and isolation. But the cuts on my arms from diving through the window were real enough, as was the torn rule sheet that I still clutched in my trembling hands. I never saw Benjamin Thorne again, despite waiting at the diner until well past sunrise. When I tried to call the phone number he'd given me, I got a recording saying the number was no longer in service. The address on the paperwork he'd provided led to an empty lot on the outskirts of town. But 3 days later, I saw a familiar job posting in the local newspaper's classified section. Night watchman needed. Abandoned property. Excellent pay. Must be comfortable working alone. I called the number listed in the ad, and a nervous-sounding man who introduced himself as Robert Chin asked if I could meet him at a diner to discuss the position. When I told him I'd already worked that job and knew exactly what he was offering, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "You survived a full shift?" he finally asked, his voice filled with what might have been hope. "Barely," I admitted, "and I'm not going back." "But you could," he pressed. "You know the rules. You understand what you're dealing with. We could pay you double the normal rate." I hung up on him, but the call haunted me for weeks afterward. How many people had Chin approached before finding someone desperate enough to take the job? How many more David Hoffmans or Elena Vasquez's would disappear into Camp Desolation before someone found a way to permanently close that place down? I never found out what happened to the camp after I escaped. I moved to a different state within a month and did my best to forget about that terrible night. But sometimes, usually in the hours just before dawn, I still hear echoes of those children's voices calling my name. And sometimes when I'm driving late at night and my headlights catch a glimpse of someone standing by the side of the road wearing what looks like a camp counselor uniform, I remember that the entities from Camp Desolation might not have been destroyed when I tore up those rules. They might have just been set free to find new hunting grounds, new victims to add to their collection. The rules were never meant to protect us. After all, they were meant to keep those things contained. And now, thanks to me, they're not contained anymore. If you ever see a job posting for a night watchman position at an abandoned property, especially one that offers excellent pay for what seems like simple work, I have one piece of advice for you. Don't take the job. Some places are abandoned for very good reasons. And some things that seem dead and forgotten are just waiting for someone foolish enough to wake them up. Camp Desolation is still out there, in one form or another, and it's still hungry for new additions to its collection. Don't let yourself become the next name tag in their memory garden. Trust me on this one. I barely made it out alive, and I had the rules to guide me. You might not be so lucky.